All right. I don't know if I want to make this daily. I think I should for myself. For myself, I should make this daily. I was already postponing it, and I was like, all right. Because I caught myself reading some, and then I was like, okay, you know what? Let me read some. Let me have some extra eyes on me to make sure that I'm reading. uh, so I decided to go back and because I felt like uh, maybe a good idea to address Kant's or reread Kant's uh, explanation of space and how it's an intuition. Then I also thought it'd be a really good idea to kind of go through his doctrine of elements real quick before he talks about space because there's a section that I like where he breaks down the process of how he views just how we get to intuition, how we get to understanding, and how concepts arise. Um, and so I thought this section would be just nice to kind of uh, read, and maybe those that haven't seen it or heard about it. I thought it was I really like this part for some reason. So let's start. Uh, okay, so the Transcendental Doctrine of Elements, first part, the Transcendental Aesthetic. In whatever way and through whatever means a cognition may relate to objects, that through which it relates immediately to them, and at which all thought as a means is directed as an end, is intuition. So this here, Kant's already defining his terms. Um, I think that's why I like this section because he starts to define his terms, um, and how he views intuition. This, however, takes place only insofar as the object is given to us, but this in turn, at least for us humans, is possible only if it affects the mind in a certain way. The capacity, the receptivity to acquire representations through the way in which we are affected by objects is called sensibility. Objects are therefore given to us by means of sensibility, and it alone affords us intuitions. Okay, so he's already going. This is why I like this part because he's already going through the process of how we reach intuition. But they are thought through the understanding, and from it arise concepts. So objects affect us. We are affected by the objects. This is called the sensibility, which affords us some type of intuition. But it's through this kind of thoughts of understanding that the concept arises. Okay. Then he says, but all thought, whether straight away or through a detour and direct, must, by means of certain marks, ultimately be related to intuitions. Thus, in our case, to sensibility, since there is no other way in which objects can be given to us. Okay. I can immediately tell this is where Hegel becomes important because I remember reading, I think like the preface. Yeah, I think it was the preface of Hegel, and he already goes about uh, addressing this in some way, if I remember correctly. And I think this is why he ends up saying consciousness itself becomes the standard to how we measure. But I think for Kant, it's the intuitions. I might be wrong. I might be wrong. But I really do feel like for Kant, intuition is like the measurement. Well, I guess if I'm going to be more correct, pure reason. Okay. So let's go back. It's related to intuitions. Thus, in our case, to sensibility, since there is no other way in which objects can be given to us. The effect of an object on the capacity for representation, insofar as we are affected by it, is sensation. So the effect of an object, as long as we become affected by it, is the sensation. Okay. So this is interesting. So when we are affected by objects, this is what he calls sensibility. But the effect of an object for its representation, the capacity for representation is sensation. All right. I'm just repeating this to myself and talking to myself here. Don't worry about that. Okay, resuming. That intuition, which is related to the object through sensation, is called empirical. The undetermined object of an empirical intuition is called appearance. The undetermined object of an empirical intuition is called appearance. I call that in the appearance which corresponds to sensation, its matter. But that which allows the manifold of appearance to be ordered in certain relations, I call the form of appearance, since that within which the sensations can alone be ordered and placed in a certain form cannot itself be in turn sensation. The matter of all appearance is only given to us a posteriori, but its form must all lie ready for it in the mind a priori, and can therefore be considered separately from all sensation. So he's saying that the appearances of the matter is only given to us a posteriori, but its form must already lie for it in the mind a priori. Okay. And can therefore be considered separately from all sensation. So it's the form. Okay. I call all representations pure in the transcendental sense, in which nothing is to be encountered that belongs to sensation. Accordingly, the pure form of sensible intuitions in general is to be encountered in the mind a priori, wherein all of the manifold appearances is intuited in certain relations. This pure form of sensibility itself is also called pure intuition. I think I highlighted this before, but I like this part. The pure form of sensibility itself is also called pure intuition. So if I separate from the representation of a body that which the understanding thinks about it, such as substance, force, divisibility, etc., as well as that which belongs to sensation, such as impenetrability, hardness, color, etc., something from this empirical intuition is still left for me, namely extension and form. These belong to the pure intuition, which occurs a priori, even without an actual object of the senses or sensation as a mere form of sensibility in the mind. I call a science of all principles of a priori sensibility the Transcendental Aesthetic. There must, I feel that's a very strange sentence. There must, therefore, be such a science which constitutes the first part of the transcendental doctrine of elements in opposition to that which contains the principles of pure thinking and which is named transcendental logic. I've read this little portion before, the little asterisk, but it mainly has to do with the way the term aesthetic is used. Yeah. Okay. And then here. In the Transcendental Aesthetic, we will therefore first isolate sensibility by separating off everything that the understanding thinks through its concepts so that nothing but empirical intuition remains. Okay. Second, we will then detach from the latter everything that belongs to sensation so that nothing remains except pure intuition and the mere form of appearances, which is the only thing that sensibility can make available a priori. In this investigation, it will be found that there are two forms of sensible intuition as principles of a priori cognition, namely space and time, with the assessment of which we will now be concerned. Okay, so now begins so Kant is going through, he already made it clear that it's the forms here that are a priori, and he's going to try to make the argument about space and time being these intuitions. All right. So the Transcendental Aesthetic, first section on space. By means of outer sense, a property of our mind, we represent to ourselves objects as outside us, and all as in space. In space, their shape, magnitude, and relation to one another is determined or determinable. Inner sense, by means of which the mind intuits itself or its inner state, gives, to be sure, no intuition of the soul itself as an object. Yet it is still a determinate form under which the intuition of its inner state is alone possible. Okay. So that everything that belongs to the inner determinations is represented in relations of time. Time can no more be intuited externally than space can be intuited as something in us. Now, what are space and time? Are they actual entities? Are they only determinations or relations of things? Yet ones that would pertain to them even if they were not intuited? Or are they relations that only attach to the form of intuition alone, and thus to the subjective constitution of our mind, without which these predicates could not be ascribed to anything at all? In order to instruct ourselves about this, we will expound the concept of space first. I understand by exposition the distinct, even if not complete, representation of that which belongs to a concept. But the exposition is metaphysical when it contains that which exhibits the concept as given a priori. Oh. Okay, here it goes. Space is not an empirical concept that has been drawn from outer experiences. For in order for certain sensations to be related to something outside me, that is to say, something in another place in space from that which I find myself, thus, in order for me to represent them as outside and next to one another, thus not merely as different but as in different places, the representation of space must already be their ground. Thus, the representation of space cannot be obtained from the relations of outer appearances through experience. But this outer experience is itself first possible only through this representation. So, I mean, I feel like this is kind of interesting because the concept of things occupying space, I feel like that does have that does hold some water. I mean, if you think about it, like when you point at an object, you're already implying some kind of space, right? Like it's here and not there. When you're talking about like the position that it occupies, or the space that it occupies, right? Like when I look at this desk or when I look at my phone, I immediately am making some kind of recognition of this space, whether I'm actually paying attention to not. And I also think about like just the way that I move around in the world. Um, something, the fact that I move around and move towards and away certain obstacles, I'm already acknowledging the concept of that this thing that is in my way is occupying space that I cannot pass, or I'd have to go through a specific pathway to uh, go through it. So the representation of space is already within all that stuff. So I feel like that's where it can hold water. And it's interesting that Kant decides to strip it entirely of its empirical uh, notions, and then and then say that it's intuition. Which, I mean, I can see it. I can see it. So, all right, back to it. Number 2, space is a necessary representation a priori, that is the ground of all outer intuitions. One can never represent that there is no space, though one can very well think that there are no objects to be encountered in it. It is therefore to be regarded as the condition of the possibility of appearances, not as determination dependent on them, and is an a priori representation that necessarily grounds outer appearances. Okay. Space is not discursive. It's not a discursive, or as is said, a general concept of relations of things in general, but a pure intuition. For first, one can only represent a single space, and if one speaks of many spaces, one understands by that only parts of one and the same unique space. And these parts cannot, as it were, precede the single all-encompassing space as its components, from which its compositions, from which its composition would be possible, but rather are only thought in it. It is essentially single. The manifold in it, thus also the general concept of spaces in general, rests merely on limitations. From this, it follows that in respect to it, an a priori intuition, which is not empirical, grounds all concepts of it. Thus, all geometrical principles, for example, that in a triangle, two sides together are always greater than the third, are never derived from general concepts of line and triangle, but rather are derived from intuition, and indeed derived a priori with apodictic certainty. Space is represented as an infinite given magnitude. Now one must, to be sure, think of every concept as a representation that is contained in an infinite set of different possible representations as their common mark, which thus contains these under itself. I'm going to highlight that. So it says, now one must, to be sure, think of every concept as a representation that is contained in an infinite set of different possible representations. I really like that line for some reason. As their common mark, which thus contains these under itself, but no concept as such can be thought as if it contained an infinite set of representations within itself. I'm going to repeat that again. But no concept as such can be thought as if it contained an infinite set of representations within itself. Nevertheless, space is so thought, for all the parts of space, even to infinity, are simultaneous. Therefore, the original representation of space is an a priori intuition, not a concept. Interesting. 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 So he doesn't even say that space is a concept. Space is not even a concept. Wow. All right. The Transcendental Exposition of the concept of space. It's funny that he says it's not a concept and he uses it in the title. I'm just kidding. I'm giving him a hard time. Okay. I understand by a transcendental exposition the explanation of a concept as a principle from which insight into the possibility of other synthetic a priori cognitions can be gained. For this aim, it is required, 1, that such cognitions actually flow from the given concept, and 2, that these cognitions are only possible under the presupposition of a given way of explaining this concept. Geometry is a science that determines the properties of space synthetically and yet a priori. What then must be the representation of space? What then must be the representation of space be for such a cognition of it to be possible? It must originally be intuition, for from a mere concept, no propositions can be drawn that go beyond the concept, which, however, happens in geometry. Introduction 5. But this intuition must be encountered in us a priori. Okay, so he's saying it has to be, space can't possibly be a concept because then if it was a concept, we wouldn't be able to make propositions that go beyond the concept itself. And so he uses geometry to point out that fact. So I will reread that again. He says it must originally be intuition, for from a mere concept, no propositions can be drawn that go beyond the concept, which, however, happens in geometry. Okay. But this intuition must be encountered in us a priori, prior to all perception of an object. Thus, it must be pure, no empirical intuition, for geometrical propositions are all I can't even say that word again. Apodictic, that is to say, combined with consciousness of their necessity. For example, space has only 3 dimensions, but such propositions cannot be empirical or judgments of experience, nor inferred from them. Now, how can an outer intuition inhabit the mind that precedes the objects themselves, and in which the concept of the latter can be determined a priori? Obviously not otherwise than insofar as it has its seat merely in the subject, as its formal constitution for being affected by objects and thereby acquiring immediate representation, that is to say, intuition of them, thus only as the form of outer sense in general. It says, thus our explanation alone makes the possibility of geometry as a synthetic a priori cognition comprehensible. Any kind of explanation that does not accomplish this, even if it appears to have some similarity with it, can most surely be distinguished from it by means of this characteristic. Um, so I guess if you deny this, I guess in Kant's opinion or Kant's mind, I'm not gonna say opinion. I guess in Kant's explanation of this, if you deny the possibility of geometry, um, well, I'm gonna rephrase that. If you deny what Kant is saying, then you would be denying the possibility of geometry itself. At least that's how I'm understanding it. Okay. But notice how he says it lies in the subject, right? It lies in the subject. Obviously not otherwise than insofar as it has its seat merely in the subject. Okay. Conclusion. A. Space represents no property at all of any things in themselves, nor any relation of them to each other. That is to say, no determination of them that attaches to objects themselves and that would remain, even if one were to abstract from all subjective conditions of intuition. For neither absolute nor relative determinations can be intuited prior to the existence of the things to which they pertain, thus be intuited a priori. Space is nothing other than merely the form of all appearances of outer sense. That is to say, the subjective condition of sensibility, under which alone outer intuition is possible for us. Now, since the receptivity of the subject to be affected by objects necessarily precedes all intuitions of these objects, it can be understood how the form of all appearances can be given in the mind prior to all actual perceptions, thus a priori, and how, as a pure intuition in which all objects must be determined, it can contain principles of the relations prior to all experience. We can accordingly speak of space, extended beings, and so on, only from the human standpoint. If we depart from the subjective condition under which alone we can acquire outer intuition, namely that through which we may be affected by objects, then the representation of space signifies nothing at all. This predicate is attributed to things only insofar as they appear to us, as to say, are objects of sensibility. The constant form of this receptivity, which we call sensibility, is a necessary condition of all the relations within which objects can be intuited as outside us. And if one abstracts from these objects, it is a pure intuition which bears the name of space. Since we cannot make the special conditions of sensibility into conditions of the possibility of things, but only of their appearances, we can well say that space comprehends all things that may appear to us externally. Like this. Okay. We can as well say that space comprehends all things that may appear to us externally, but not all things in themselves, whether they be intuited or not, or by whatever subject they may be intuited. For we cannot judge at all whether the intuitions of other thinking beings are bound to the same conditions that limit our intuition and that are universally valid for us. If we add the limitation of a judgment to the concept of the subject, then the judgment is unconditionally valid. The proposition, all things are next to one another in space, is valid under the limitation that these things can be taken as objects of our sensible intuition. If here I add the condition to the concept and say, all things as outer intuitions are next to one another in space, then this rule is valid universally and without limitation. Our expositions accordingly teach the reality, that is to say, objective validity of space in regard to everything that can come before us externally as an object, but at the same time, the ideality of space in regard to things when they are considered in themselves the reason. That is to say, without taking account of the constitution of our sensibility. We therefore assert the empirical reality of space with respect to all possible outer experience. Though to be sure, its transcendental ideality, that is to say, that it is nothing as soon as we leave aside the condition of all possibility, the condition of the possibility of all experience, and take it as something that grounds the things in themselves. Besides space, however, there is no other subjective representation related to something external that could be called a priori objective. For one cannot derive synthetic a priori propositions from any such representation as one can from intuition in space. Strictly speaking, therefore, ideality does not pertain to them, although they coincide with the representation of space in belonging only to the subjective constitution of the kind of sense, for example, of sight, hearing, and feeling. Through the sensations of colors, sound, and warmth, which, however, since they are merely sensations and not intuitions, do not in themselves allow any object to be cognized, least of all a priori. The aim of this remark is only to prevent one from thinking of illustrating the asserted ideality of space with completely inadequate examples, since things like colors, taste, etc., are correctly considered not as quality of things, but as mere alterations of our subject. So I think Kant here plays a reverse Uno card, right? Where we say, the beans taste, I don't know, like the beans taste stale or something. This wouldn't say anything about the beans. It would just say that there is an alteration in the subject. So that I feel like that's what I understood correctly, right? So he's saying, he said, are correctly considered not as quality of things, but as mere alterations of our subject, which can even be different in different people, right? So if somebody were to have a bowl of beans, or all of us were to have a bowl of beans, and I say, well, these beans taste like they're bad, and someone says they taste like they're good, it's not that it has anything to do with the beans. It's the fact that we're experiencing different alterations within the subject, because we're both different subjects tasting beans. Okay. For in this case, that which is originally itself only appearance, for example, a rose, counts in an empirical sense as a thing in itself, which yet can appear different to every eye in regard to color. The transcendental concept of appearances in space, on the contrary, is a critical reminder that absolutely nothing that is intuited in space is a thing in itself, and that space is not a form that is proper to anything in itself, but rather that objects in themselves are not known to us at all, and that what we call outer objects are nothing other than mere representations of our sensibility, whose form is space, but whose true correlate, the thing in itself, is not and cannot be cognized through them, but is also never asked after in experience. All right, so that finishes up the his views on space. Um, and I think Kant addresses color and taste and all that because that's the first thing I think about when I think when uh, that's the first thing I think about when we talk about the term aesthetic. Like something is aesthetically pleasing. Uh, typically we talk about the appearance of it, but when we talk about the appearance, it seems like we commonly refer to like the way it looks, the color, the taste, and so on. So I think that's why Kant addressed that, because he's like, this is not what I mean by aesthetic. It can't. It's not. It's none of those things because of the reasons that he just gave, right? Um, because they're not quality of things; they are the alterations of us, the alterations to the subject. But yeah, I enjoyed reading that section. I think I was looking through a little more past the because I already did the one on time, but there is a little part where it's still about time, but I guess I'll have to read that tomorrow. Um, yeah, because I know we already gone through the time section because I went conclusion through the concepts. I read the elucidation yesterday. We just finished the space one today. I think I'll have to start on this one. Yeah, the general remarks on the Transcendental Aesthetic. That's the one I'll do tomorrow. And then I think that, let me see, I think that will finish up. No, that's a lot longer than I expected. um, okay, yeah. Okay, so yeah, that will be the part. And then we'll go into the transcendental logic. Okay, well, anyways, thank you guys for watching and reading along with me. And that's it. All right. Take care, guys.